The Arctic wind howled like a living creature, whipping the sea into white-capped fury. Ada Blackjack stood on the deck of the battered schooner, clutching her thin coat tightly around her. The frozen spray stung her face, and the ship lurched beneath her feet, the icy ocean clawing at its sides. Ahead lay nothing but endless, glinting ice, and behind her, a life she had desperately tried to escape. Ada had no choice but to go forward. The year was 1921, and Ada Blackjack, a quiet 23-year-old Inuit woman, found herself part of an expedition to claim Wrangel Island in the name of Canada. For Ada, it was not adventure or glory that drove her but desperation. Life in Nome, Alaska, had been cruel. Her son Bennett, her only light, was gravely ill with tuberculosis, and poverty left her powerless to help him. When she heard about an Arctic expedition in need of a seamstress, offering decent pay and the promise of eventual rescue, she took it as a sign. Ada, who had grown up in a mission school with little connection to her Inuit heritage, knew nothing about survival in the wild. But if enduring this journey meant she could afford proper care for her son, she was willing to risk it all. Yet as she stood on the ship's deck, staring into the biting expanse of ice, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The crew was a mix of optimism and tension. The leader of the expedition, Alan Crawford, was young and brimming with ambition. He was determined to secure Wrangel Island as a new frontier for Canada, despite its history as an uninhabitable wasteland. Crawford's enthusiasm infected Milton Gall, a bright-eyed and eager crewman who seemed more interested in glory than practicality. In contrast, Fred Maurer, the most seasoned of the group, was reserved and skeptical. He had survived the Arctic before, and his wary glances at their limited supplies hinted at a simmering unease. Lorne Knight, strong and pragmatic, balanced the group with his sharp tongue and steady demeanor. Ada, the only woman, felt invisible. The men largely ignored her except when they needed repairs to their clothing or someone to cook. She kept to herself, avoiding conflict, though Crawford's overly casual assurances that they would be rescued in a year, maybe two, gnawed at her nerve. As the schooner approached Wrangel Island, the Arctic revealed its cruel beauty. Jagged icebergs loomed like ancient fortresses, and the water turned a deep, menacing blue. The island itself was stark, a stretch of snow-covered tundra dotted with rocky outcroppings. It looked more like a prison than a place to call home. The crew scrambled to unload their supplies before the ice closed in, sealing off their route back to civilization. Ada worked silently, carrying bundles of food and equipment to their makeshift camp. She tried to suppress the gnawing fear in her stomach as she watched the ship's captain, a burly man with a grim face, argue with Crawford. "You're cutting it too close," the captain warned, gesturing toward the ice forming in the bay. "We can't linger. If we get trapped, we're as good as dead." Crawford waved him off with a confident grin. "We'll be fine. Just a few more trips, and we'll have everything we need." The captain's glare lingered, but he relented. Hours later, as the ship finally disappeared over the horizon, Ada felt a wave of isolation crash over her. They were alone now, truly alone, in one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. The first weeks passed in relative calm as the group settled into their routine. The men constructed a rudimentary shelter from driftwood and tarps, reinforced against the brutal winds. Ada worked tirelessly, sewing fur-lined garments to keep them warm and preparing meals from their dwindling rations. She tried to focus on her tasks, avoiding the growing tension among the men. Crawford's optimism began to wear thin as the reality of their situation set in. Hunting was scarce. Seals and polar bears, their primary food sources, were elusive. Supplies were rationed carefully, but even Ada could see the numbers didn't add up. One night, as the group huddled around their small stove, Fred Maurer broke the uneasy silence. "We're not going to last a year out here with what we've got," he said bluntly. His voice was low but firm, cutting through the howling wind outside. Crawford frowned, his usual bravado faltering. "The supply ship will come in the spring," Stephenson promised. Mora's eyes narrowed. "Stephenson's promises don't mean much." He's not the one freezing his ass off out here. The tension crackled like the fire between them. Ada kept her head down, mending a torn glove, but her hands trembled. The men's doubt echoed her own fears. Winter descended with brutal swiftness. The sun disappeared below the horizon, leaving them in perpetual twilight. Temperatures plunged, and the howling wind became a constant presence. Ada wrapped herself in every layer she could find, but the cold seeped into her bones, relentless and unyielding. The men grew irritable and withdrawn. Small arguments over food and chores escalated into shouting matches. Maurer and Crawford clashed often, their once cordial relationship deteriorating into outright hostility. Milton Gall, usually cheerful, withdrew into himself, while Lorne Knight's patience grew thin. Ada became an observer, watching the group's cohesion unravel. She worked tirelessly, sewing, cooking, and trying to avoid notice. But the Arctic spared no one. One night, as Ada lay in her sleeping bag, a sharp crack echoed through the camp. She bolted upright, heart pounding, as the men scrambled outside. The ice had shifted, a massive slab breaking off and groaning under its weight. "Check the supplies," Crawford shouted, his voice barely audible over the wind. Ada grabbed her coat and rushed to the cache, her breath freezing in the air. A portion of their food stores had been crushed by the shifting ice, leaving them with even less than before. Back in the shelter, the mood was grim. Crawford tried to rally the group, insisting they could hunt more in the coming week. But Maurer shook his head, muttering, "We're on borrowed time." Ada sat silently, clutching her knees to her chest. She thought of Bennett, his small, fragile body racked with cough. The cold in her chest wasn't just from the Arctic, it was the weight of knowing she might never see him again. As the weeks stretched into months, the isolation became unbearable. The men grew gaunt and hollow-eyed, their movements sluggish from hunger. The Arctic was unrelenting, a silent predator waiting for them to falter. One morning, as Ada trudged through the snow to collect driftwood, she saw something that made her heart stop. Tracks, large, deep prints leading toward the camp. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized they belonged to a polar bear. She ran back, shouting a warning. The men grabbed their rifles, scanning the horizon. The bear emerged moments later, a massive silhouette against the white landscape. It lumbered toward them, its black eyes fixed on the camp. Shots rang out, echoing across the tundra. The bear retreated, wounded but not dead. Ada's hands shook as she stared at the blood-streaked snow. "That was too close," Knight muttered, his voice shaking. Ada nodded, the reality of their fragility sinking deeper. Cliffhanger. That night, as Ada lay awake, she heard the wind shift. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it carried a strange sound, a distant howl, low and mournful. She sat up, her heart pounding. Was it wolves? Another storm? Or something worse? The Arctic, she realized, was not just a place. It was alive, vast, and merciless, and it was watching them. The wind screamed across the icy tundra, battering the fragile walls of their shelter. Ada Blackjack pulled her coat tighter around her as she crouched in the flickering light of the stove. Outside, the endless Arctic darkness stretched unbroken, but inside, it was the silence that unnerved her most. The men weren't arguing tonight, not after what they'd seen. The massive shadow of the polar bear, stalking just beyond the reach of their rifles. But Ada knew the Arctic wasn't finished testing them. Winter had fully claimed Wrangel Island. The sun had abandoned the sky, leaving them in near-constant twilight. The darkness was oppressive, a heavy weight that pressed against their spirits as much as their bodies. The days and nights bled together in a monotonous cycle of hunger and cold. Ada busied herself with tasks to keep her mind occupied. Stitching holes in fur-lined parkas, scraping sealskins clean, and boiling what little food they had left. The men grew thinner and quieter, their faces hollowed by exhaustion and despair. The bear returns. The polar bear's tracks had become a haunting presence around the camp. Every few days, the men would spot its trail, spiraling closer. Ada stayed alert, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. Was the bear simply curious, or was it biding its time, waiting for their defenses to weaken? One night, her fears were realized. A crash shattered the brittle silence, followed by Crawford's panicked shout. "It's here!" Ada scrambled from her sleeping bag, her heart pounding. Outside, the massive bear loomed, its pale form blending into the snow except for its glinting eyes. The men fired their rifles, but the shots only grazed its thick fur. The beast roared, the sound reverberating through the frozen air. "Reload!" Mauer shouted, fumbling with trembling hands. Finally, a bullet struck true. The bear let out a guttural growl before retreating into the darkness. The camp was safe for now, but the encounter left them shaken. Ada couldn't help but wonder, how many more nights like this could they survive? Fractures in the group. The bear wasn't the only threat to their fragile unity. Tensions between the men erupted more frequently, fueled by hunger and the suffocating isolation. Crawford's leadership faltered under the weight of their predicament. Mauer, ever the pragmatist, openly criticized him, while Knight tried to play mediator. Milton Gall, once the cheerful optimist, retreated into a shell of quiet despondency. Ada overheard him muttering to himself late at night, his voice tinged with despair. The men's frustrations often spilled over onto Ada. Though she worked tirelessly, they saw her as an outsider, someone who didn't pull her weight. Crawford accused her of hoarding food. Mauer snapped at her for being slow with repairs. Ada bore their anger in silence, but inside, she felt the cracks forming. Lorne Knight falls ill. In January, the first true blow struck. Lorne Knight fell ill. It began as a persistent weakness, but soon he was bedridden, his face pale and drawn. The group suspected scurvy, a common affliction in the Arctic where fresh food was scarce. Ada, despite her fear, took on the role of caretaker. She boiled water, massaged his stiff limbs, and fed him what little she could spare from her own rations. Knight's condition worsened with each passing day, his once strong frame wasting away. "I'm not going to make it, Ada," he whispered one night, his voice barely audible. "Don't say that," she replied, her voice firm but trembling. "You'll get better." But deep down, she wasn't sure she believed her own words. A desperate decision. As Knight's illness progressed, the group faced a grim choice. Mauer and Gall proposed leaving the camp to search for help. It was a dangerous gamble. The Arctic was a vast, unforgiving expanse, and the odds of finding rescue were slim. "We can't all stay here and wait to starve," Mauer argued. "It's our best chance." Crawford hesitated but eventually agreed. The plan was set. Mauer and Gall would leave at first light, while Crawford would remain with Ada to care for Knight. The morning of their departure was somber. Ada helped pack their supplies, what little they could spare, and watched as the two men disappeared into the horizon, their figures swallowed by the endless white. She prayed silently for their success but knew the Arctic rarely showed mercy. The weight of isolation. Days turned into weeks, and the camp grew eerily quiet without Mauer and Gall. Ada's world shrank to the small circle of her duties, tending to Knight, repairing clothing, and staving off the oppressive loneliness that crept in like the cold. Knight's condition continued to deteriorate. Feverish and delirious, he ranted about home, about the rescue that still hadn't come. Ada did her best to comfort him, but her own resolve was faltering. She clung to memories of Bennett, his small, frail body curled against hers, and whispered promises she didn't know if she could keep. The Arctic was relentless. Supplies dwindled to nearly nothing, forcing Ada and Crawford to make agonizing choices. They stretched what little food they had, but hunger gnawed at them constantly. A dire revelation. One afternoon, as Ada searched the horizon for any sign of Mauer and Gall, Crawford approached her, his face pale and drawn. "They're not coming back," he said bluntly. Ada stared at him, the words sinking in like a dagger. "You don't know that," she replied, her voice shaking. Crawford shook his head. "It's been too long. Even if they found help, they wouldn't survive the journey back in this weather." The weight of his words pressed down on Ada. If they were truly alone, their chances of survival had dwindled to almost nothing. Cliffhanger. That night, as Ada sat by the dim stove, a strange sound reached her ears, a distant howl, low and mournful. She froze, her heart pounding. Wolves. She grabbed the rifle, her hands trembling, and stepped outside into the freezing darkness. The howling grew louder, closer. Shadows moved at the edge of the camp, their glowing eyes piercing the gloom. Ada tightened her grip on the rifle, her breath visible in the frigid air. She knew that this time, it wasn't just the wolves testing them, it was the Arctic itself, pushing them to the brink of survival. The wolves came with the night. At first, Ada heard only the wind, sharp and relentless as always, but then it shifted, blending with the guttural growls and sharp howls that sent a chill down her spine. She gripped the rifle tightly, her knuckles white as she stood at the edge of the camp, staring into the frozen darkness. The glowing eyes of the pack pierced the void like embers, circling just out of range. She couldn't tell if they were hunting her, or simply waiting for her to falter. Days blurred into nights, marked by a growing sense of dread. The wolves didn't attack immediately, but their presence was constant. Their howls echoed through the endless Arctic twilight, a haunting reminder of how exposed they were. Ada could feel their hunger, an echo of her own, gnawing away at her resolve. Inside the shelter, Lorne Knight was slipping further into fevered delirium. His mutterings, once coherent, had become an incomprehensible mix of prayers and memories. Ada tended to him tirelessly, but her strength was waning. Crawford, too, was unraveling. He spent hours staring at the horizon, muttering about Stephenson's promised rescue. His bravado had long since given way to a vacant, haunted look. A shadow over the camp. The wolves grew bolder as the days passed. One evening, Ada returned from collecting driftwood to find paw prints circling the shelter, fresh, too close for comfort. She quickly secured the entrance and checked the rifle, her heart pounding. "We're not going to last like this," Crawford muttered, his voice low and bitter. He sat near the stove, his face gaunt and shadowed. "They'll wear us down, pick us off one by one." Ada didn't respond. She focused on preparing the meager stew, her hands trembling as she sliced the last of their salted meat. She couldn't afford to entertain his despair, not when she was barely holding herself together. The breaking point. The wolves finally struck, during one of the few moments Ada allowed herself to sleep. A sudden crash jolted her awake. Crawford's shouts filled the air, followed by the guttural snarls of the pack. Ada grabbed the rifle and stumbled outside, the cold biting her face like knives. She saw Crawford struggling with a wolf, its massive jaws snapping inches from his face. Without thinking, she raised the rifle and fired. The shot rang out, deafening in the still night, and the wolf collapsed. The rest of the pack scattered into the shadows, their eyes gleaming with fury. Crawford staggered back, blood staining his coat from where the wolf's claws had raked his arm. "You almost got yourself killed," Ada said, her voice trembling with anger and fear. Crawford didn't reply. He sank to the ground, clutching his arm, and for the first time, Ada saw tears streak his face. Isolation and despair. The attack left them shaken and more isolated than ever. Crawford's injury became infected, and his condition worsened rapidly. Ada did her best to clean the wound with melted snow and scraps of cloth, but without proper medicine, the infection spread. Lorne Knight, still bedridden, drifted further from reality. Ada often heard him calling for his family in the middle of the night, his voice weak and desperate. The camp felt like a tomb, the walls of the shelter closing in on Ada as the weight of her responsibilities crushed her spirit. The wolves remained nearby, their howls a constant reminder of the thin line between survival and death. A moment of clarity. One morning, after a sleepless night of tending to both men, Ada stepped outside to clear her mind. The sun had briefly risen above the horizon, casting a pale, golden light over the frozen landscape. For a moment, the Arctic's beauty took her breath away. The ice sparkled like a sea of diamonds, and the distant mountains glowed softly in the sunlight. It was a stark contrast to the fear and despair she carried inside her. As she stood there, she thought of her son, Bennett. His face, so small and fragile, filled her mind. She had come here to save him, to give him a chance at a better life. That purpose, that love, was the only thing keeping her alive. Ada straightened her shoulders and tightened her coat. If the Arctic wanted to break her, it would have to try harder. The wolves return. The brief moment of peace didn't last. That night the wolves returned in full force. This time there was no circling or waiting, they attacked. Ada and Crawford scrambled to defend the camp. The rifle felt heavy in her hands as she fired into the pack, the recoil jolting her shoulder. Each shot sent a wolf yelping into the snow, but more kept coming, their growls filling the air like a storm. Inside, Crawford shouted, his voice hoarse with pain. They barricaded themselves in the shelter, the walls trembling as the wolves clawed and slammed against them. Ada held the rifle tightly, her finger hovering over the trigger. She could hear their snarls, their teeth gnashing just inches away. For hours they held their ground. Finally, as dawn approached, the wolves retreated. The silence that followed was almost as deafening as their attack. A grim decision. The attack left Crawford too weak to continue. His wound had worsened, and the infection now spread through his body like wildfire. He called Ada over one morning, his voice barely above a whisper. "You have to leave," he said, his eyes glassy and sunken. Ada shook her head. "I can't leave you and Knight here alone." Crawford's hand trembled as he reached for hers. "If you stay, you'll die. You're strong, Ada. You can make it?" She swallowed hard, tears burning her eyes. The thought of leaving them behind, of stepping out into the Arctic alone, was almost unbearable. But deep down, she knew he was right. Cliffhanger. That evening, Ada packed what little she could. The rifle, a few scraps of food, and the thickest coat she could find. She stood at the edge of the camp, looking back at the shelter where Knight and Crawford lay, both barely clinging to life. "I'll come back," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. The Arctic stretched before her, vast and merciless. With one last glance at the camp, Ada stepped forward into the unknown. The Arctic was eerily quiet, a stillness that seemed to echo Ada's solitude. Each step felt heavier than the last, her boots sinking into the snow. The rifle strapped to her back was a comfort and a burden, its weight pressing down like the enormity of her choice. Ada glanced over her shoulder one last time, but the camp was gone, swallowed by the endless white. Ahead of her lay nothing but miles of ice, cold winds, and a fragile hope that she could survive long enough to find rescue. And yet, as she trudged forward, she whispered a promise to herself. "I will not die here." The journey begins. The landscape was a vast expanse of ice and snow, broken only by jagged rocks, and the occasional driftwood carcass scattered like relics from another world. Ada walked with purpose, though her body screamed for rest. The Arctic sun offered no warmth, its pale light barely piercing the frigid air. Each night, she dug a shallow shelter in the snow, wrapping herself in furs to preserve what little heat she could. Her body ached, and the pangs of hunger gnawed at her relentlessly. But Ada's resolve remained unbroken. Her mind drifted often to her son, Bennett. She imagined his small hands reaching for her, his laughter cutting through the cold silence. The thought of holding him again fueled her steps, even as frostbite nipped at her fingers and toes. A brush with death. On the third day, a blizzard swept in without warning, the wind screaming like a living thing. Snow blinded her, stinging her face as she struggled to find shelter. She clutched the rifle tightly, knowing that stopping could mean freezing to death. She stumbled upon a shallow cave, barely large enough to crawl into. Inside, the wind howled against the rocks, and the temperature dropped further. She huddled there for what felt like an eternity, the Arctic's fury raging outside. As the storm subsided, Ada emerged into a world transformed. The snow was deeper, the landscape unrecognizable. Disoriented, she struggled to regain her bearings. But quitting was not an option. She whispered Bennett's name under her breath and pressed on. An unexpected ally. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ada spotted movement in the distance. Her heart leapt with both hope and fear. She raised the rifle, her hands shaking as the figure came closer. It was a fox, its red fur stark against the snow. The creature paused, its intelligent eyes meeting hers. For a moment, they simply stared at one another. Then, as if sensing her need, the fox turned and trotted away, stopping to glance back. Ada hesitated, then followed. The fox led her to a patch of exposed tundra where she found something miraculous, a small cache of edible plants, hidden beneath the snow. She dropped to her knees, tears freezing on her cheeks as she harvested the precious find. The fox watched her from a distance before disappearing into the night. The ultimate test. Days stretched into weeks, and Ada's strength began to wane. The food she had scavenged was gone, and the Arctic's vastness seemed endless. Her fingers were blackened with frostbite, and every breath felt like fire in her lungs. Then came the wolves. They reappeared one night, their howls cutting through the stillness. Ada froze, clutching the rifle. The pack emerged from the shadows, their eyes glowing with predatory hunger. This time, there was no shelter, no barricade. It was just Ada and her will to survive. She fired the first shot, her aim steady despite her trembling hands. The pack scattered but regrouped, their growls growing louder. Ada screamed, a primal sound that echoed across the tundra, and fired again. One wolf lunged at her, its jaws snapping inches from her face. She struck it with the rifle but, her strength fueled by sheer desperation. The pack retreated eventually, leaving her shaking and gasping for air. A ray of hope. The attack left Ada battered and bleeding, but she pressed on. She knew she couldn't endure much longer. Her vision blurred, her steps faltered, and she began to wonder if she would ever see another human face. Then, on the horizon, she spotted it, a dark shape against the blinding white. At first, she thought it was a mirage, but as she staggered closer, she realized it was a sled team. Her voice cracked as she screamed for help, her legs giving out beneath her. The sled team came closer, their figures blurry but real. Strong hands lifted her onto the sled, and for the first time in months, Ada allowed herself to hope. Return to civilization. The rescue team brought Ada back to the mainland, where she was met with a mix of astonishment and disbelief. Her story spread quickly, the tale of a woman who had survived the Arctic's merciless grip. But Ada cared little for the attention. Her mind was on her son. Bennett was waiting for her when she finally arrived home. She wept as she held him, his tiny arms wrapping around her neck. For the first time in 2 years, she felt truly warm. Triumph and transformation. Ada Blackjack's journey through the Arctic had transformed her. She had entered the icy wilderness as a timid woman, unsure of her place in the world, and emerged as a symbol of resilience and courage. Though the Arctic had taken much from her, her health, her companions, her innocence, it had also given her something invaluable, an unshakable belief in her own strength. As she stood on the shore, watching the waves lap against the rocks, she knew the Arctic would always be a part of her. It had tested her, broken her, and rebuilt her. Ada Blackjack was no longer just a survivor. She was a warrior,